of yesterday, I've officially been making videos for 5 years. To celebrate this, I figured I'd remake my first video, which was about evolution. So, here it is. There are generally considered to be two types of evolution: microevolution and macroevolution. They're really just two sides of the same coin, but it's easier to explain by splitting them up. I'll look at micro first. Before I get too far, I should mention that any population of species has genetic diversity to it. Take a look at us humans. We are all of the same species, but we have widely different hair, skin, and eye colors, we have different heights and weights, and our general facial structure differs from person to person, among other things. This diversity of genetic traits, known in biology as alleles, arises from either mutation or sexual recombination. Mutation results from errors in the DNA copying process, which itself is usually caused by mutagens, such as radiation. In this case, the DNA code is messed up. You get an A where a C should go, for example, allowing for new traits, or alleles, to pop up over time. Another way new traits show up is sexual recombination, where, during the fertilization of an egg, alleles from one parent mix with alleles from another. This diversity is important as it ensures we don't all succumb to a single disease. It's what allows evolution to take place. Having many different types of alleles is what allows a population to adjust to its environment, i.e., if the environment changes, having diversity makes it more likely that the population will have an allele that allows the species to survive in the new environment. It is also important that there is a way for diversity to increase, which is where mutation comes in. Now we can get to microevolution, which focuses on how the prevalence of different alleles changes within a population. There are four main factors that affect microevolution: genetic drift, gene flow, mutation, and natural selection. Genetic drift and natural selection being the most important. Now in the case of genetic drift, a certain allele becomes more widespread in a population just by chance. For example, say you flip a coin 100 times. You expect the coin to land heads up about 50 times and tails also about 50 times. However, it is possible that you can get 80 heads and only 20 tails. This is the same idea of genetic drift. Pretty much randomly, one allele just becomes more popular by chance. This can be quite serious if there is only a small population, which brings us to two subtypes of genetic drift: the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. For the bottleneck effect, a population is suddenly reduced to only a few members. This could be caused by a flood, a fire, overhunting, or some other similar disaster. In the founder effect, a small group of a population colonizes a new area. In either case, the population is drastically reduced, meaning that, by chance, there could be more of one type of allele and less of another type, even if there were more of the second allele in the original population. Another microevolution factor is gene flow, which is almost the opposite of genetic drift. In this, members from two different populations of a species mate, causing alleles that may be present in one population, but not in the other, to transfer between the populations, increasing diversity. We also have mutation, which I mentioned earlier, where errors arise in the DNA sequence, allowing new alleles to develop over time. Lastly, we have natural selection. And to explain this, I'm going to bring back an old friend. Natural selection is what most people think of when they think of evolution. It is where outside forces cause certain alleles in a population to become more popular. As I mentioned earlier, diversity is the basis of evolution, as it allows a species to adapt. So let's say we have a healthy population, made up of a spectrum of colors, going from red to yellow to green to blue, and ending at black. We'll say that our Legos live on very fertile volcanic soil, so the ground is very green. There are three types of natural selection: stabilizing selection, diversifying selection, and directional selection. The underlying rule for natural selection, and this applies to all three types, is that not every creature can survive, and those that do live and reproduce pass on their alleles to the next generation. In the case of stabilizing selection, the middle ground alleles are selected for. This often occurs when the environment stays the same. In our case, let's say that the ground stays nice and green. Well, then the green bricks can hide easily, but the other bricks, which stand out, can easily be eaten by predators. As such, in subsequent generations, more green bricks will survive and reproduce, making the green color more popular. Diversifying selection is pretty much the opposite of this. More extreme alleles are selected for. In the case of our bricks, let's say that the volcano starts oozing lava again, so now the ground is black and red. Luckily for our example, the bricks and predators happen to be immune to the effects of lava. Now the black and red bricks blend easily in with the environment, so the predators have a hard time finding them, so instead they eat the now much easier to spot green bricks, as well as a few blue and yellow. In this case, the red and black bricks can reproduce easier, so there will be more red and black bricks in future generations. Lastly, we have directional selection, the most common type of natural selection, where the environment changes favoring one extreme allele. Let's say that the area floods, which our bricks and predators also happen to be immune to. So now the environment is all blue. Well, in this case, blue, and to a lesser extent green and black bricks, are well hidden, while red and yellow are very easy to find and eat. So here, blue will become more common as time goes on. In each of these cases, the environment favored a specific color of brick by making it easier to hide, which in turn allowed that color, or colors, to reproduce more easily, increasing the count of that allele. Meanwhile, colors not suited to the environment were more likely to be eaten, so it was unlikely that they could create offspring, causing that allele to die out. This is how natural selection works. Keep in mind that this works for any type of alleles. It doesn't just have to relate to color. Camouflage is just the best to explain the process. There's also a secondary type of selection force, known as sexual selection, where specific traits make a mate more attractive. These traits are usually superfluous, but indicate that the mate is big and strong. It's the reason peacocks have such big plumes. The effect is, however, negated if one of the previous selection forces I've mentioned selects against it. Now that I've discussed how the prevalence of an allele changes within a population, we can look into macroevolution, how new species develop. Macroevolution is really just splitting up a population and letting a lot of microevolution happen until the two groups can no longer mate with each other, creating, by definition, a new species. There are two ways that the species can be separated: allotropic speciation and sympatric speciation. Allotropic speciation is where there is a physical barrier between the creatures. For example, let's say a large crevice develops that splits our bricks apart and floods one side while the other side experiences volcanic activity. Over time, the two groups will go through microevolution, causing different alleles to become popular in each of the groups. If the crevice then becomes sealed up a while later, the bricks may no longer be able to breed because the genetic code is just too different. How intense the barrier has to be depends entirely on the species' ability to cross said barrier. In sympatric speciation, the species never actually become separated. Other barriers arise. In plants, this is often due to genetic mutation. The most common type of species-creating mutation is polyploidy, where, due to an error in the reproduction process, the offspring has more chromosomes than the parent, effectively creating a new species. In animals, mutation, while it still occurs, is less common. More often, the offspring might switch to a new food source or habitat, cutting them off from the rest of the population. So, while the two groups of the species are in the same general area, they don't interact. Alternatively, very severe sexual selection could arise, where one creature will only mate with another creature if it has a specific allele. Whatever separates the species, if enough time has passed and the creatures stay separate, microevolution will eventually give rise to a new species. Now, if you doubt evolution's ability to give rise to the fairly complex species that exist today, I would like to remind you that evolution builds off of previous structures. For example, the eye. It seems complicated, but we can trace back several simpler versions of it that existed as in-between steps. Similarly, the brain started out as a bundle of nerves that slowly developed. The key thing here is gradual change. That is evolution. It is essentially a series of random mutations that become more widespread in a population, either through random chance, in the case of genetic drift, or environmental factors, in the case of natural selection. If these adjustments are given enough time to accumulate away from the main population, eventually a new species will arise. And it is through these gradual changes that all life on Earth was able to develop. But nevertheless, hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something, and see ya.